Welcome to the student organization training, and today we're going to be talking about budget planning and fiscal management. My name is Sammy Bosacki, and I am an assistant director in the Department of Campus Involvement, and I primarily work with our student organizations and our fraternities and sororities on campus. Today, we're going to be talking about how student organizations can get and obtain their budget balance in their university accounts. We're going to talk about why budgeting is important and kind of what goes into budgeting for your student organization and kind of how that impacts the outcome and the opportunities for your group, how to set up a budget and kind of what is entailed in that and how you can make that work for your group. And then once you have that budget, how you manage it and how you can make sure that you are keeping track of the spending within your organization. And finally, talking about officer transitions and how you incorporate budget and fiscal management into that transition of your outgoing and incoming officers. In this presentation, it does include a lot of questions, and that's because we want that to serve as like a prompt for you to think about. Maybe you already do some of these things for your organization, but some groups do it differently, some officers do budgeting differently, and so really it's there's not like a right or wrong way. So as we ask the questions, we just hope that it kind of maybe sparks some new ideas or provide some discussion points that you can bring back to your student organization. So getting your balance, you can get the current balance of your 334 or 900 accounts by coming to the Department of Campus Involvement or emailing the student organization support staff. You can get a copy of that if you come into our office. We'll print you a copy. Otherwise, if you email us, we'll send you a screenshot of your current balance and kind of what transactions have already occurred within those accounts. And again, you can get that at any time. We do recommend that maybe, good practice would be to get the accurate updated balance at the beginning of the year and maybe at the beginning of each semester. And this way you can kind of know where your starting point is for how much you have in those accounts. And then, we recommend that you keep track of where you are spending that money, whether it's your treasurer or if you have a person that manages your finances, making sure that they're keeping track of where you have been spending your money. This way you can use it as like a checks and balance system between what you have been tracking as you're spending and then what's showing on the records on the university side, just to make sure like you can make sure that either some things maybe haven't been paid yet, or if some things have been paid and you don't have it in your records, you can just make sure to update that. So it's a really good way just to make sure that both of those pieces of tracking line up for your group, kind of help make sure you're right on track. So why is budgeting important? I kind of narrowed it down into four main things, and the first is planning ahead. So setting up a budget for your organization and for your officers allows you to know how much money you are spending or planning to spend. And as you're talking through where you want to allocate those funds, you can figure out if you actually have enough to support those initiatives or those programs or those ideas that you have. And if you don't have enough, it gives you the opportunity to brainstorm ways that you can obtain those funds, or determining if maybe you don't have enough to do what you were interested in doing, you can maybe decide to collect dues from your members so that you can support those initiatives. And so it really does help you kind of think forward instead of just, coming up with an idea and saying, we want to do this, but we don't have money. How do we make it happen? If you plan and get a budget set up for your whole year, you can work towards those things and you can start saving if you need to, or if you have money, you can, obviously just start implementing those. So it really does kind of help everyone get on the same page and determine where your organization is going and kind of what goals you have in terms of spending your money. Then secondly, it's determining your funding streams, right? So it's deciding if you are going to collect membership dues, and how many members you have to determine if you have enough to support the things that you want to do. Or, are you planning on hosting fundraisers, and what do those look like? And, how much are you going to kind of project or estimate that you will get from those opportunities? And then, having a goal for how much you want to collect from those funding streams or how much you anticipate is really great, because then it can determine, if it's something that you are projecting you'll recruit so many members for dues. That gives you a goal for recruitment, right? Like if we can recruit 10 people, then we'll have this much money, and that'll be really great for helping support the initiatives that we want. So it helps you kind of have a goal in terms of recruitment and have a goal in terms of how you're going to financially support the things that you want to do. And similarly, if you don't end up collecting the amount of money that you anticipated, do you have a plan for what you're going to do? Does that mean you need to kind of sit down and readjust your budgets, because you might not have enough now to cover what you were planning on doing? And so just really thinking through like what each of those outcomes can look like and how you're kind of going to adjust based on different options and what you might kind of encounter. Another funding stream is the Senate Finance Committee. Are you planning to request funds from the Senate Finance Committee? They are a subcommittee of the student government, and they help allocate funding to student organizations out of the free balance reserve, which comes from our student activity fees. And within their policies, they have certain criteria of what student organizations can request funding for. And so if you're planning, or if you want to explore this as a funding opportunity, maybe it's taking some time to see what you can request funds for, and what types of funds you can request, and what might be relevant to the types of goals and events and programs that you're looking to host. And are you maybe decide if that's something that you all want to pursue, so that you can maybe get some support in some of those initiatives that you're looking for. So yeah, that's another really great opportunity, but might not be relevant to all groups, just depending on, like I said, following in their policies and things like that. So something to consider and to keep on your radar. Obviously, budgeting is really helpful for your officers to know what their spending limits are, right? So it gives people a guideline to understand, how much is being spent, what it's being spent on, and officers know that they were given, say you allocate a certain amount for a specific event, then that officer knows they can't spend more than was allocated, because that's what kind of you've budgeted or worked out within that budget based on, the money that you have available, right? And so it really does help with accountability. It helps just overall kind of have a goal for that officer. They know this is what I need to do, this is how much I have, and how I can work within that to get to the end goal for that particular event or program or initiative. Another thing to consider is, do you have a plan if that officer goes over budget? If they end up going over budget because they spent too much, or maybe they realize that what they were budgeted wasn't enough. Do you have a plan if that officer needs to request more? Maybe it's a conversation that your officers can have at an executive board meeting to determine if there's a way to maybe reallocate. It could be as simple as the officers coming together and, maybe someone was budgeted for an event that they didn't use all their funds. And so they can say, hey, we have an extra $100 over here. We can allocate it to this area so that you can spend that to help support what you have going on based on what you need and what your spending is. So it's definitely helpful, and really just gives you more confidence in how you can allocate those things together. And then finally, members will know the expectations, right? So especially if you're collecting dues from them, everyone will know what the expectations are and the goals are for the organization, because you've budgeted so much money per area, and then everyone will be on the same page as to where the organization's going and kind of what y'all are looking to accomplish. Because again, if you're fundraising for your organization, it is really nice to know the reason why you're fundraising. Like if you need to fundraise $200 to help support an event that you want to do for your members, everyone knows then that if we help with this, it's going to ultimately, impact what we do and the future programs that we want to put on. So it really does all work together, and it's really helpful to kind of communicate that and talk through each of those expectations. So how do you set up a budget? Ultimately, it comes down to finding a system that works for you. And what I mean by system can be the physical document that you actually create the budget on. So I know probably the most popular would be an Excel document or a Word document. So that can be the actual physical way that you write out your budget and kind of plan where the money is going to go and how you keep track of that. But also a system of where you store this information. Is it just stored in someone's email and then hopefully that person shares it out to everybody and then it gets lost in email or whatever, right? And so finding a way that it's really easily accessible by your members or by your officers so that everyone is on the same page about what their budget is and to make sure that they can also be accountable to that spending limit. We really recommend using Microsoft Teams for our student organizations. It's really easy to store files and documents, and then also just everything's in one place. And so when you are ready to transition, you can easily just add the new officers, and then they have records of all of that, and they can look back because when you're budgeting, it is helpful to look back at what was spent in previous years, what if there were budgets and maybe they needed more money and you can see that they spent this much, we might need to allocate a little bit more. So it really is helpful to be able to access those, and if they're all stored in one place, then it's just really easy for people to go back and look. And also, if there's a certain template that you use, you can save it in this space, and then that new officer, as they're working on the new budget, they can just go and click on that, save it for the new year. And so it's just really easy to kind of keep that information consistent and easy to access. So how, as you're working on setting up a budget, how do you decide to allocate your funding? Is it that your treasurer just sits down and kind of goes through the list and just allocates money into each of the areas? Or, is it each officer presents a budget that they would like for their position? This is how much, as a secretary, this is how much I'm going to need to support our meetings, or PR, our promotions person, our marketing, this is how much I'm going to need to print for this year or whatnot. And so is it each officer bringing that piece, or is it exec board sits down during one of your meetings and you kind of talk through, everyone kind of working together, talking through what they need in each of those areas? So I think it just depends again on the organization and what you all feel is most applicable to your group, and then just deciding on that, and even considering writing down what that process looks like. And so when you are transitioning, you can give that information to the new officers as well. And as you're building that budget, some of the things that you might want to include or think about as you're writing it is, obviously you want to include what your current balance is. If you have money in there, how are you planning to use that, if you're planning to use it, or is it something that you keep as like an emergency savings type of area, so that, in case somebody does go over budget, you have a little bit of wiggle room there. I definitely recommend every organization should keep at least a couple $100 just as an emergency, in case something comes up or in case you need to dip into that, because you would really hate to collect money and then go, spend down to zero. And if you accidentally overspend, you'll go negative, which is not allowed. And so just kind of thinking through some of those things and building that in as you're working on this process. And of course, as you are building this, making sure that you are including all of your income sources if you have multiple different areas or where you're projecting income coming from. For example, Senate Finance Committee, membership, dues, fundraising, things like that. So as you're building it, you can really make sure that all those pieces are coming together. and the projected amount. So making sure that you have a way to anticipate how much you think you will get from each of those, and then using that to maybe help allocate some of those budgeting components. So we will talk through an example of a budget here in a second. But finally, organization of how you want the structure of your budget. And so, maybe it's you want line items organized by position. And so it could be that, you give a certain amount to the president, a certain amount to the secretary, to the treasurer, so on and so forth. And then those officers are responsible for spending within that area. Or maybe you set up your budget so that it's organized by event specific. Like if you have, candy that you buy for your meetings, and you have printing set aside to promote your group, and then it's specifically laid out to those areas. You can do it either way, or you can do a combination of both of those ideas, or however it makes sense for your organization. I think ultimately it's really up to you and what you all feel like makes the most sense as you're tracking it. But it is really helpful just to kind of think through how you might organize it so it makes the most sense. So I pulled up this template that was created by the Interfraternity Council a couple years ago, and it's a pretty in-depth Excel spreadsheet. And so you can utilize something like this, or you can have something much simpler. But we did want to let you know that this template can be found on the student organization website under the budget and finance section. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a budget template document that you can download, and it's essentially this document with everything is blanked out, so you can fill in the information specific to your organization. And what's really great about this template is that this front page actually pulls from the expenses and budgets tab here, so that it's kind of really laid out nicely, and you can kind of they all like work together within this document, so it's really helpful. So as you can see, they have outlined here their anticipated membership dues. The organization does collect dues from their members, and that's how they kind of determine their spending for the year. And for those particular semesters, they have a set aside amount that they charge per member. I think this year it was $23, and so they were estimating that they would have a certain amount of members in the fall times 23, and then that's how they would get to the 1,700 number, which is then what they worked off of to allocate money to each of the areas, which I'll show you in a second. And so then they saw or anticipated in the spring that they would have more members based on recruitment and things, and so then they would have a little bit more income to work with in the spring. They also, as I said, have that emergency money, so they kind of set aside $300 just to make sure in case anything comes up or they need to utilize that. Nothing in their 334 accounts. And then here you can see it. This is pulling from this expenses and budget site. And so it's really pulling in per event, but within each of those officer positions. So it's really helpful to kind of see that at a glance. So if we jump over to expenses and budget, as I mentioned, it's all laid out by position, and then within the position it's broken down by the actual spending line or the event. And so for their national dues, they projected that it would be about $90. For this retreat, they were anticipating spending $300. And so within the same sheet, they can put the actual amount that was spent, so they can see they anticipated that it would be $15 more for the national dues, and so they actually have an extra $15 here to spend. Or they didn't end up needing $300 for this retreat, so they have that kind of rolling over, which then will help support some other initiatives as well. And so as you can see here, for printing, they didn't budget anything, but maybe they ended up deciding to spend something on printing. They could add that in here so that it's reflected and recorded. So, maybe when the next year they're trying to plan their budget, they can look and say, hey, we ended up needing to spend some money on printing. So let's budget some money this year so that we can make sure we can cover those costs and know that that's something we'll need to cover. And so they can use this document for future reference as well. And similarly, right, you can see that they budgeted $575 for their fall recruitment, ended up spending over that amount, right? So they spent $700, which means that they, went over budget a certain amount, and this $129. So, it's important to consider that then, overspending on this budget impacts, the rest of the budget, right? Because they went over their amount. And so, then they can say, well, we didn't spend all this money that we allocated up here, so that will help offset this overspending that we did. But obviously you don't want to do that too much, because then you're going to be dipping into your emergency, or you're going to go negative because you are over, you're going over what you actually spent. And so, maybe it's good practice to talk about those spending amounts before you actually spend it. Or if you're going to go over, talking about that before you actually spend the money, to make sure that you can cover this cost in other ways, or that you can find it in other areas to offset that overture. So just something to consider as you're planning through. But again, that's just kind of the same practice that's listed throughout this document here. So this transactions tab, I think, is also a really helpful tool, because the budgets shows what you are budgeting for that area and then what was actually spent, but it's hard to know what was this $33 that was spent. And so that's where the transactions section can come into play, because you can list out, in this case, they listed out what position it was under, and then what the actual, what the actual thing that you spent the money on was. So if it's this fraternity and sorority stickers, they could put that was $33, and then they know exactly what that money was spent and how it breaks down. Again, so this can be helpful for the treasurer to make sure that you're keeping track of each thing that's being spent, and for future, right? So you can look back and say, oh, this is how much was spent on this particular event, and that's really good to know, so we can make sure we budget that much in the future. So just another really helpful way. But ultimately, you can decide what type of system works best for you. If it's in a Word document and you kind of just have it written out, that's totally great. And then maybe you just have a separate one that keeps track of what you actually spent, where it was spent, how much was spent on which, and saving that somewhere so that people can access it and look back at kind of that transaction log. So then once you have your budget set up and you know where you are going to be collecting your money, and what it's going to be, or what you're anticipating it's spent on, you need to manage through that process. So do you have a process for how your officers spend that money? Is it that they need to check in before they spend anything, to make sure that all those things add up? Or maybe if you need to buy candy for a meeting, maybe your treasurer is just responsible for buying those things, so that they can keep track of it in their document. Or maybe your advisor helps you purchase some of those things. And so it's just making sure that you have a process, whatever that process is, making sure that it's laid out so your officers know what that expectation is and how to spend that money, and keeping track of those spending. Do you have does your officers have to get any of their spending approved before they buy anything, or do you allow your officers to spend as long as they're keeping track and within their budgeted amount? I think it just kind of depends on how it works best for your organization. I do think it's helpful to kind of have some of those checks and balances and those accountability, just to make sure that everyone's staying on the same page, because going over budget can really impact other parts of your funding income and things. So just keeping that in mind, and maybe having some type of approval or checks and balance process will be helpful. Is it the process that your officers bring receipts or invoices back to the treasurer so that they can keep it all in one place? Or maybe, they scan it or take a picture, and those are all kept in a file somewhere, so that the treasurer knows exactly what items were bought, and they can see it, keep track of it for future as well. This is really important too, because in case there ever is an audit for anything, you'll then have access to all those receipts and invoices, and you can quickly pull those up and kind of show and work through that. It's really good practice. So keeping receipts, or if it's not sent to the treasurer, is it the responsibility of those officers? I think it's just figuring out what works for your organization. And managing a budget is talking about accountability, and is it something that you present your current balance, or do you talk about that at exec board meetings? Do you present annually about your budget at general meetings? Here's how much we brought in, here's how much we spent. That's generally really good practice to include, because it does help make sure that your members know that their hard work is making a difference. If they helped with a fundraiser, or if you're collecting dues, that they know what exactly their dues are going towards, so that you can just kind of show like all these pieces work together. And so if it's not every meeting, maybe it's deciding, maybe it's once a month, or maybe it's once a semester, or once a year, but kind of having some way that people know how money's being spent and worked through. And finally, officer transitions. And so, something to think about is, do you include this information about budgeting and your budget process and your spending process in any of your transition pieces for your incoming and outgoing officers? Obviously, the treasurer should know all of these things and should be telling the incoming officer or new position holder. But, is it something that you also incorporate into all of your other officer transitions? Because majority of the time they're going to be spending money or having to keep track of their spending. And so is it something that you can weave in to that process so that everyone's on the same page, right? So, making sure your treasurer knows that process, making sure that officers know what processes are in place for spending money, or are they responsible for creating that budget, right? So that everyone is just on the same page and that they know the expectations of that role. Also, is this something where you can include the information about how officers and the treasurer and your leadership can find out where do they get the balance? How do they pay for things? How do they spend money? Like, those are all things that the Department of Campus Involvement can help with. And it's really good to be able to pass that information along to them, so they also know and they're not left in the dark or kind of left trying to figure that information out on their own. Yeah, and I think this is also a really great opportunity to talk with, to talk the outgoing officer and the incoming officer to talk through, how it went. Did you have enough to plan the things that you wanted to? Did you realize, we really did need more? Or, the fundraising chair realizes, hey, one just wasn't enough. Maybe we need multiple. And so those are really great touch points that you can talk to and help set up the organization for long-term success, so that the new officers are prepared as they're walking into those roles. And that recaps and kind of end their training here about budget management, budget planning, and financial success, right? And so all of these things, as I said, do work together to make sure that our organizations are healthy and successful, and that you all kind of know where you're going, right? If you have money and you know how you're going to spend that, or if you decide, hey, we want to do certain things, so we're going to need to fundraise and kind of work toward that goal, it does kind of rally people together and help get everybody on the same page. So it's a really good practice and really helpful to make sure, like I said, longevity and sustainability of your membership and of your student organization. So thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Sammy Bosacki, and all of the Department of Campus Involvement staff are happy to help, and we're happy to help meet with you to talk more specifically about your budget, about planning, about finding ways to fundraise, or the financial piece of it. I know that's a big part of the functionality of our student organizations, and we are here to help you navigate that. So please let us know. Our contact information is available on our website, and you can reach out to us and set that up at any time, and we would love to help you. So thank you so much and have a great day.